All right, so this is the last section here of Module 10. And we're going to kind of spotlight Japan during the late 19th century, because if the general rule of imperialism is that Europeans are able to spread out and dominate the globe, Japan really is one that stands up and is an exception to that rule. Not only is it able to escape imperialism, but it's also able to industrialize at the same time. So it doesn't have the imperialistic influence, but yet it is still able to industrialize as though the Europeans had brought that to them. And it becomes an imperial power in its own right, actually. There's some great examples of, the area that they're able to successfully cover, and they're able to resist it, so it deserves its own kind of focal point. So we're going to look at the case of Japan and kind of see how they're able to escape from this idea of imperialism in the late 19th century. Now, Japan had basically cut itself off from contact with the West all the way back dating to 1637. And this was around the time that a major political change had taken place in Japan. One of the noble families, called the Tokugawa family, had risen up to take control of the Japanese government. And they viewed contact with Westerners as basically a threat to their power, which is pretty smart on their part to kind of have that, foresight to see and go, hey, if we allow the Westerners to come in, that's going to threaten not only our power over Japan, but probably our traditions and all that stuff. So in 1637, they passed an edict which bans contact between the Japanese and foreigners. And they told the Japanese they're not allowed to travel outside the island. So they create this very, very extreme form of isolationism. Everybody from Japan had to stay on the island, and it isolates them very, very well. It did allow for very limited contact. They did allow Dutch merchants a couple times a year to come in at specific ports of entry and have limited trade. And so they did have access to some Western goods, but it was only a couple times a year. They limited how much influence those people were able to have and how much access the West was able to have to them. Because remember, this edict not only said that, hey, we're not going to, as a government, we're not going to deal with it. If any Japanese person was found to be kind of colluding and dealing with the West, they could be in major trouble. I mean, this was a complete ban, basically like, you're not allowed to talk to those people. If you see them pulling up, you should tell the government and we're going to take care of it. Don't talk to them, don't deal with them. And so this would end up changing, however, in the 19th century, in the 1800s. When America makes contact with Japan in 1853, it's the U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew Perry, not to be confused, obviously, with the famous actor from Friends. But obviously, he arrives in Japan in 1853. He establishes diplomatic contact with the Tokugawa family, who are still ruling Japan. And when Matthew Perry arrives, the Japanese don't want to meet with him at all. And remember, contact with foreigners was completely banned. And so the edict is still in force. And according to the terms of the edict, any Westerner that sets foot on Japan would be killed, literally. They kind of put the word out, hey, don't come here or we're killing you. So Matthew Perry came with American naval ships. He sends gifts on shore to the Japanese, some basic gifts from the United States, which included 2 white flags, which are a very clear message to the Japanese that that either they, meet with him or that he was willing to attack them. And these flags that they could use to surrender to him, basically. And in fact, he did seem to have fired at a couple coastal towns just to kind of demonstrate the power of the U.S. Navy ships. So he's like, hey, y'all need to meet with me. And they were like, we're not going to. And then he shot a couple of their towns up with his battleships. And they were like, maybe we'll meet with them. And the reason that America wanted to make contact was that they wanted the ability to go fishing off the coast of Japan. And they wanted to be able to go hunt whales, because there's a lot of whales in the Sea of Japan. And the whales are very important in the late 1800s because there was a lot of uses for oil. And whale oil you would get from their blubber and their fat, and this could be used to light lamps. And so it could also be used as fuel. You also used it for like cosmetics and industrial lubricant. And so whaling was a very important industry for the Americans in this time period. Well, Matthew Perry comes to Japan and he sees that the Japanese had all these different impressions of this contact with the West. On one hand, they have images that are produced of the first contact meeting that were very benign, like the ones you kind of see here on the left where, Matthew Perry shows up, it's kind of basic. On the other hand, there's some images that are produced that you see here where, Matthew Perry is kind of seen as this terrible, horrible villain, essentially, like a demon invader. And so it makes him kind of look like a monster to some extent. Now, this dueling imagery can be seen with the images of the ships that Matthew Perry comes to Japan with, okay? This kind of makes the ships themselves look very demonic. They're black ships with smoke pouring out of them and all of this stuff, right? And so eventually, Matthew Perry is able to open up these diplomatic relationships, and eventually the U.S. uses its technological advancements in the military to convince the Japanese they're better off signing a treaty with the U.S. Than with any of the other European nations. And the treaty that they end up signing with the U.S. Is called the Harris Treaty of 1858. It's another example of a very unequal treaty. It favors, the terms of the treaty definitely favor the United States. And so some of the things that the U.S. Are going to get is like extraterritoriality, which is a very fancy word for saying that basically the United States citizens could go there and could not be tried by Japanese courts. So basically, they're not subject to Japanese law necessarily, or they'd have to follow the law, but they couldn't be put on trial in Japan. So if they broke the law, they had to be tried by U.S. courts. So basically, they were saying, Japanese doesn't apply to the Americans, and so obviously this is a clear advantage to Americans because if they're being tried in U.S. courts, chances are they're going to, if they commit crimes against the Japanese people, who's going to care? So it definitely places America above the law in Japan. And in terms of the treaty, they set very low tariffs for American goods. This means that Americans are going to have to pay low taxes on the goods that they import into Japan, which means that their goods are going to be very competitive on the Japanese market. Now, Japan does get some benefits from the treaty, namely they're allowed to purchase military supplies from the United States. And this is going to come in handy later on down the road. But overall, the terms of the treaty are definitely in favor of the United States. While the shogun, the head of the government of the Tokugawa family, he does sign this agreement, it's really unpopular in Japan as a whole because of how many benefits it's giving to the Americans. As the Tokugawa family becomes more and more unpopular, it provides an opening for a shift in politics. So in 1868, we have what's called the Meiji Restoration. And the emperor is able to basically kick the Tokugawa shoguns out of power and kind of step up and claim more political power for himself. And the emperor that is in power at the time is Emperor Mushito. And he basically stops becoming just a figurehead, and instead he builds a coalition of noble families behind him to support his rule. And one of the things that the emperor does is he ends this unequal treaty. And so basically he gets rid of those provisions like extraterritoriality and low tariffs that were kind of in favor of the Americans and says, we're not going to do that anymore. And he's able to get away with this because the Americans view Japan as kind of being insignificant. They don't have they basically have no raw materials to take. They don't have rubber, they don't have oil, they don't have diamonds or gold or anything like that. Remember, Japan is a chain of volcanic islands. It's a volcanic island. And so there's no real reason for America to think that they're a major threat, like they're going to industrialize and take over anything. And so, the Americans at this point had just finished their Civil War. They're in the process of rebuilding and reconstruction, and the South is going on. And so Japan is able to play things very well here. Now, the emperor begins the process of westernizing Japan, though, because he realizes what allowed that inequality in treaties to take place was that the United States had technological military advantages over them. And he realizes that, hey, if I'm going to end this, and this is my kind of window to get the European powers in America out, in order to keep them from coming back and taking back over, I'm going to have to catch up. I'm going to have to westernize to some extent. And so he eliminates the samurai, and basically the samurais were private armies of the nobles of Japan. He gets rid of them, and instead he modernizes the army and places it under the control of the imperial government. And there's some kind of craftiness that comes into this. Now, what I've always found was interesting was that, we think of samurai being like way back when, right? But I want you to understand that, the telegraph, we talked about Samuel Morse, right? Telegraph was invented in 1861, I believe. I have to look that up again. 1860, maybe 1863, right? The samurai are kind of disbanded by 1868, right? And Abraham Lincoln is fighting in the Civil War at 1864. So, there was a point in time when Abraham Lincoln could have sent a telegraph to a samurai. Yeah, like a real ninja. That's kind of, no? You don't think that's interesting? I think that's kind of cool because we think about samurai being like way back when Abraham Lincoln could have sent a telegraph to a samurai. That's awesome. Anyways, the Japanese government had bought quite a bit of military technology from the United States, and they had also asked a lot of the military advisors from the United States to come over and train their armies before they kind of cut them off, which was really smart. So basically, they got the United States to give them military technology, then train them how to use it, and then they kicked them out. They're like, okay, we don't need you anymore, also don't come back. And they're also going to get a lot of economic benefit from this. And so, the emperor is very crafty, and he starts to create industry with things like steel and other kind of heavy industries like that. And he's going to be seen as a threat to Western industry. So instead, if he does that, if he starts with like these heavy industries like production of these materials, the West is going to be like, hey, that's our gig, you can't do that. So he decides instead, that he is going to focus on light industry. He's going to create consumer goods. Initially, most of the consumer goods are low quality, but he's also industrializing, and because his products are inferior to the West, again, they're not going to see this as a threat, but they're learning. It's kind of like, the equivalent of the Japanese stuff would be like going to kind of the dollar store today. You can go to Walmart and get something that is, perceived to be a little bit better quality, right? Or you can go to the Dollar Tree, get it for $1.50 or whatever it costs now, because even their prices have gone up, or $1.99 or whatever it is, and you're gonna be like, oh, it's basically the same thing, right? The dollar store's still going to make profit, though. And so they're exporting stuff, but it's not as good, so people aren't like, oh, we got to stop them from doing that. But they're able to resist this imperialism by doing this. The final step of Japanese resistance is when they become an imperial power themselves. And we see them doing this on the basis of war. So they're able to modernize their military and their navy. They purchase materials from the West to build their navy as well. They train their military forces and their naval forces. They get advisors that they're paying from the West to teach them how the West does warfare. They're learning all these things very well, and then they put those lessons into action in a series of wars that they're going to fight in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We're going to touch on two of them that are rather significant. So the first one is the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. This is the war where Japan goes and fights against China. Sino is the word for China here. And it fights China, and out of this conflict with China manages to win territories of Korea and Taiwan. Now, this is going to be important for Japan because Japan has colonies which it can now use as a source of markets for the goods that its industries are producing. They can sell the goods to them, And because the people in the West aren't really buying them, but now the people in their colonies will buy them. And this is going to help Japan build up its industry even further. However, by expanding into Korea and Taiwan, it does start to make Russia kind of nervous, because Russia has interests in the Pacific Ocean, and Russia wants to expand into the Pacific. It wants places like Korea and Taiwan as well. They also had their eye on China. So although they can't take China because everybody in the West is basically interested in it, they're kind of carving it up into spheres of influence. And Russia sees Japan expanding in the Pacific, it feels threatened, and eventually is going to bring a war between the Russians and the Japanese. And this starts in 1905, called the Russo-Japanese War. This particular conflict, the Japanese are also successfully able to defend Korea. They beat the Russians. It's kind of an amazing feat, and you can kind of see this political cartoon here where the Russian bear is all like bandaged up because this Japanese fella just beat him up. And believe it or not, while they were trying to take territory from the Japanese are actually able to take territory from the Russians, most notably Manchuria, which is in northeast China. And believe it or not, the Japanese are much more industrially advanced than the Russians are at the time. So it was a difficult fight for the Russians, and plus, you think about where Japan is, all the way on the other side of Russia. The military headquarters are in St. Petersburg on the very European side of Russia. So trying to fight a war when you have 2,000 miles, 3,000 miles between where you're fighting and where all your military leaders are at, obviously that leads to some difficulties. And this is, where you kind of see this fascination of how do the Japanese do this? Well, those are really kind of how they do. It also didn't help that the Russians are also fighting with the Ottoman Turks at this point in time, so they're kind of fighting on both sides of their country, kind of divides their attention. And so the Japanese are able to win, and this really allows them to burst onto the world stage and show that they're a growing power themselves. Now, as we noted at the beginning of this lesson, it's very historically significant because Japan is really the only non-Western country to industrialize and become as powerful as the other European powers are. Japan's influence is going to continue to grow in the Pacific during the First World War, and in fact, Japan would become rather frustrated with the fact that the West would not allow them to expand even further, which, following the First World War, they kind of contribute to that war and say, hey, you all get to carve up parts of the world following World War I. We want some additional territory too. But because Japan had already beat China, had already beat Russia, the Western powers are kind of leery of them because they have no influence over them at all. And so they're like, we don't think so. And this makes Japan really mad. They see themselves as equal and actually even better than most of the European powers. They see themselves as more capable and better off, that they've been able to hold on to their traditions and still have created this strong military. And so when they get shut out of this expansion of colonialism and imperialism, they really feel kind of slighted. And it's this fight for being able to advance is really going to lead them into what ends up happening in World War II, where they're willing to even partner with Germany and Hitler in order to be able to gain more territory, because all the other countries had already told them no. And so this is going to create national rivalries, particularly with the United States. And so, as we kind of move into the 20th century there, Japan is really going to be making some major moves that are going to have major effects as we get into World War I and World War II. And that's where this module is going to end.